Hello and welcome to Agents of Nonprofit. My name is Alexander Lapa, and I'm here to speak with everyday superheroes helping nonprofits. Joining me today is EJohnson to talk about mass market fundraising. Evan, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Alex. I'm really happy to be here and excited to talk with you today.
Well, fundraising is definitely one of my favorite topics, definitely a popular topic on the show, so excited to see a different perspective on that topic. But before we begin, I would love to, if you could share with people, what is your superhero origin story? That is to say, how did you get started working with nonprofits?
I'm sure many other nonprofit fundraisers like myself have similar stories of didn't initially plan to do working with nonprofits or nonprofit fundraising in particular. So my superhero origin story was going back to my graduate school period. I was in Washington, D.C., coming from Oregon, newly married, and had just graduated from George Washington University, and it was political management. I wanted to run political campaigns or do polling or anything like in that world, which was similarly like focused on inspiring people to, vote or support a candidate or a cause in that form. I worked on the Hill as an intern and done just some light work, but was exploring opportunities and somehow ended up my first job at a direct mail agency and was there for about 4 years and still wasn't quite sure what I wanted, but then ultimately went on to work for my hometown organization in Portland, Oregon for quite a bit. And that's where I really realized I really like this fundraising thing. And I was able to broaden my experience beyond just direct mail and work on all sorts of fundraising channels and audiences. And that just became my career ever since then.
Cool. So where are you now? Do you have your own firm? Are you working with another firm? What is your current status?
Right now, I work for an amazing organization. I'm back in DC, actually. I work for Project Hope, and we are a global health and humanitarian relief organization. And we work in over 30 countries and do disaster response as well as long-term development work.
Awesome. So as we're broaching the topic of fundraising, I was hoping we could paint the landscape of, I had a sense, and maybe you can confirm it, that fundraising was kind of shook up a little bit because of the pandemic. So I was wondering if you could maybe paint the picture of what fundraising looked like up into the pandemic and then afterward, just to give people an idea of, the landscape of things and see things at a very high perspective.
Absolutely. Well, one note is my fundraising has been primarily for organizations and international relief. So that's going to be my lens for a lot of my answers with you today as we talk. And so, keep in mind that my answer to this is going to be a little bit different than, other sectors. But I think for me, I definitely agree with you in that, fundraising up until a couple of years ago, there was definitely the pre-COVID period and the post-COVID period. And I think for me, the pre-COVID period was very focused on just direct marketing, straightforward channels. You invest this, you get this. And you had no real turbulence going on. Everything felt like it was organically evolving and growing over time. And it was just about the challenges then was how much should you invest in a particular channel? How do you leverage top of funnel marketing, those sorts of things. For me as an international organization, there was always that global disaster that could immediately shake things up and you had to pivot and quickly respond to, and you could see a huge influx of donors. So that still existed for me pre-COVID as it does post-COVID.
So it sounds like a well-oiled machine. You put money in, you have a certain expectation of what the ROI is going to be, but there was not so much in terms of variation. There's always going to be a certain amount, of course, but there isn't an extraordinary amount of variation. You knew how the system worked, right?
Yeah, I would say there's definitely some nuance to that, right? There's a lot of organizations were really starting to focus a lot more on monthly giving and sustainer and mid-level, higher value audiences as critical, but especially monthly giving, and that's only continued to increase each year.
Yeah, obviously you want to have in the moves management sector, you want to be able to move people up to get them more involved, more contributing more, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But then, so then obviously COVID happened, everything got messed up. The box was scrambled quite a bit. So what have you noticed in the past couple of years as things have lightened up in terms of the pandemic?
Yeah, I would say there's so much, right, to cover here, but my like bullets for that is definitely fundraising is it's changing so fast. It's very unpredictable. It's like the evolution of fundraising is so rapid now, especially during COVID, but also even right now. And I think one thing is that this is why I also brought up international relief and how that was still the case. Emergency fundraising or rapid response was still the case for me pre-COVID. I think during COVID, a lot of organizations and sectors were experiencing what emergency or rapid response fundraising was like for the first time. And then that just kind of continued, right? With, I think I go back and I think back to 2016 too, with like the Trump administration and what they call the Trump bump. Like there were definitely organizations that experienced emergency fundraising around that. But I think smaller, more rapid response, quick moving moments have occurred a lot. So they could be social related, not necessarily disaster related. And so for me, that in working for Project Hope, we've had an emergency happen in small or large form ever since 2019. So it's whether it's been an earthquake, whether it's been hurricanes, whether it's been the Ukraine conflict, and they could be really small media moments too. So there's definitely that. But I also think privacy changes with iOS, with the privacy movements going on impacting digital, that it's no longer straightforward to, especially for digital, understand and invest in Facebook advertising or things like that. So a lot of people moving to search. But overall, I feel like right now, things are just changing really fast. There's a lot of rapid response moments and a lot of uncertainty going on.
Yeah, I mean, so I definitely got the same sentiment, even though I'm, a little bit removed from the closeness that you are at. So you said social changes, not so much disasters, constant change and evolution. Privacy is definitely a good one because, yeah, Apple did change the way things, at least the emails are conceived to be or perceived to be or interpreted to be opened and closed and so forth and clicked. Any other changes that you've noticed besides those? I had the feeling that you had more on your list, but you stopped.
Yeah, so I think there's other things. I think like a lot of nonprofits have experienced the rise of new payment options for even donor audiences. There's cryptocurrency giving, which is very connected, not just as a type of payment, but also a whole new audience. There's always been an element of peer-to-peer fundraising, even back, before the last few years. But the younger generation and the rise of the creator economy has meant live stream fundraising is across Twitch and YouTube has become really prominent, and the organizations like St. Jude and other charities like Project Hope have been getting into that. And yeah, I think just ultimately there is the Gen Z and younger audiences are entering the space and kind of like mixing things up in terms of what they look for in a charity too.
Yeah, we had a gentleman on not so long ago talking about micro communities and how to tap into them as a source of fundraising to build connections with these kinds of communities, which I thought was really fascinating. And yeah, I mean, technology wise, of course, has been almost like a hockey stick at this point where it's just changing on a monthly basis, crypto, AI, and so on. So it's not just a matter of like the social changes or how people change, it's actually how, I guess, not everything is changing, but a significant amount of different factors right across the spectrum. It's not just technology or personality. It's across all of it almost.
Absolutely. And yeah, I love the point about the micro communities. And I think that's what I was getting at with the younger generation as well. And the creator economy. I think Michael from Tiltify, the CEO at Tiltify, recently put out their release on trends, right? And they touched on, the creator economy no longer really just being applicable to young people either, right? And that there are micro communities across all generations, which is definitely fascinating to think about how that's going to impact the coming years as well.
So then, aside from, because yes, I totally agree with everything that you just said. Aside from micro communities and content creators and so forth, or creator community, any other ways or tips that you can offer to people who are trying to connect with young donors? Because I know that's always been a challenge. I think you've mentioned already that the expectation is a bit different than it used to be. And I know that there's a general trend also for people to give less, or maybe the people who are giving are no longer giving, and the new ones that are supposed to pick up the mantle haven't. So I'm curious to know if you could offer any kind of suggestions or recommendations for how to otherwise connect with the youth.
There are so many things that come to mind for this that I've experienced myself, both as a direct marketer, but also working with, like you said earlier, younger donors in peer to peer fundraising in the communities there. And I think connecting back to rapid response moments, that the younger generation is definitely one that is very much like moment driven. They are looking to find causes that need urgent support, and it's driven by what they're seeing on their social media, from their peers, from the news. And so I found, right, for Project Hope that any disaster that happens or any big moment, they immediately want to help. And so, but whether that's through donating or fundraising with their communities, that has been, that crosses all generations, but especially the younger generation I'm seeing. But it's very connected to, they want to fundraise and they want information. And the information, how they get it is they kind of expect almost direct access to someone at the nonprofit to build trust. So if they're choosing an organization, they're going to reach out maybe on social media or email and try, or even if you have a Discord, they're going to try and connect directly with someone. And if you're the one that can do that, then you're more likely to get chosen because they feel that sense of trust because of that access that you're giving them.
That's a really good point, because I mean, if you know that, then you can set up an infrastructure to be able to have people to connect to, right? As long as you know that there's a need for it, then having someone in your staff on the nonprofit to be able to say, all right, this person or these people are kind of focused on, or at least are aware of, there could be a phone call or a reach out in some way. And let's make sure we do respond to them, because that is now one of their primary ways of connecting and bonding with a nonprofit.
Absolutely agree. Yeah. And I think, like, I love the point about the infrastructure because, that I think, like, that's part of, right? Like, you got just thinking about where they are, or, they're on social media. So, like, having key people on the front lines of your, like you said, donor services, social media, community manager, whatnot, where you're, you're giving them content via social where they are that's meaningful to them, but also you're responding to direct messages. You basically, you have that availability, and honestly, they're not gonna be afraid to contact you at 12 a.m. or something, right? Like, they, especially during these rapid response moments. So that's just another thing, is like bandwidth, and the organizations that are going a bit above and beyond are going to be rewarded with that.
So it sounds good. Any other tips for connecting to young donors besides making sure that there's someone to connect to?
I think the other piece there is that I've seen is DEI is important to them. And I mean that from, like, authentic DEI, which can, in my mind, it can be like really just commenting on the key issues of the day that they care about. Like really tapping into what your organization does and what they care about at any given time, whether it's like Pride Month or about mental health or something that happens in the news or in that moment. And they are kind of looking at your organization to say something about it. And if you are able to say something about it, to do so. So, they're looking for organizations that show that they have similar values as they do. So it's very much like they want to align with an organization, not as a transaction, but something that they can truly be a part of and feel passionate about as a person.
Yeah, so if you're a faceless nonprofit, that's probably a bad move or a bad situation for you to be at this point. It sounds like you need to be take a position on certain things, but that would of course beg the question: if you do take certain positions, you might alienate certain possible donors. And there is obviously two sides of that coin. Maybe that is a good thing in a certain extent, because you then will resonate and connect with more deeply with the people you're trying to connect with. And it might make certain people less inclined to connect. But at least by taking a position, people know your stand. You're not just a completely fluid organization that will just say yes to everything. You do have a certain perspective that is, of course, aligned with your values and what you're trying to achieve. And then by doing that, hopefully the intention is at least to connect more deeply with those donors.
Well said. And I think like there's definitely a nuance to it, right? Like it goes back to that trust and transparency. You know, just be let's just be transparent with them. If you can't comment on something and you explain why, they'll get it. They'll be like, okay, yeah. Because again, it's like that's showing, like you said, you're not a faceless organization. So it's like someone directly tells them maybe why they aren't doing XYZ, and it makes sense to them, and it's truly transparent. I've had many instances or questions or around things where I've explained it, and they're like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense, and then they support us, right? So you got to be afraid to lose someone, even if maybe you aren't going to give them the answer they want to hear.
Okay. Yeah, based on my experience from what I hear, it's definitely aligned. The connection, it takes longer. Like you have to have a more long-term mentality than a short-term mentality as an organization, in the sense of it might take you longer to build those connections, but once you do, you will have them for a long time. They will be engaged with a long time. They'll want to work with you. They'll want to promote you. So it's a bit maybe
Yes.
frustrating to say, I can't just send off a direct mail anymore, expect a super response, close that book and move on to the next one. It's more like, okay, this is a ongoing relationship that I need to build. Like in any relationship, there's a give and a take and communication, and it takes time for you to fully trust both ways. But it's worth it because once you get to that point, then you're able to really keep them around like a good friend for hopefully the rest of your life.
Well said. Yeah, I've experienced this so much. Like, yeah, if you build that bond with them, they're your brand, enthusiastic brand ambassadors in some ways. Like they're out there, like spreading the word, and a lot of like this is an always online like audience, right? And so it's like they're sharing it all over their social media. They want to wear your t-shirts or swag, or they'll tag you in a post if like there's a company or someone looking for an organization to support. So they're out there trying to think of ways beyond just fundraising or donating to help you.
Mm. What about, I've seen where, especially on LinkedIn these days, in order to start building a community as a person on LinkedIn, one recommendation is that you start building something in public. That even though you're not fully refined on a particular product or a service, you're basically pinging your existing community on LinkedIn to ask them, hey, what is your opinion about this? Would this or this work or resonate more with you? And the whole concept is just, getting that kind of feedback and not having a fully developed product or service just yet. Is there any merit to that kind of concept in trying to connect deeper with these younger donors? Like, could nonprofits reach out to young donors and look, we're kind of thinking about doing this kind of fundraiser event or this kind of something. I'm not fill in the blank. What do you think? What are your thoughts? Getting their thoughts, which of course can be perceived as very, as a way of building a connection. And then once you have enough information, you actually build the thing.
I think that's a really good example of, how to tap into that audience in an authentic way. You got to pay attention to where they are and talk to them. And like don't wait for them to come to you. And especially if you already have them as supporters, they love that. I in my mind, I think of it as like co-creation, where they love to weigh in and provide feedback on, whether it's like even a marketing effort, right? Like they like that stuff. So if you want them to weigh in and leverage them as a resource for how you as an organization can connect with their peers, that not only helps you do so, it definitely builds that bond with them to make them feel like they're doing more to help you than just a transaction of fundraising or donating.
Exactly. I mean, those are the two keywords, I think: conversation and co-creation. That's the mentality you want to take.
And I think that's definitely like, that's hard, right? Because we're all, you have to find that line where you still have your brand as an organization and your guidelines and like it's like you're getting feedback and creating something, but you're still kind of making sure you set your boundaries and guardrails for your brand that still is how you want to come across, like publicly, but it's like reinterpreted to fit that younger audience that you're trying to inspire. If that makes sense. Like I think that, because a lot of organizations, big and small, whether it's the brand marketing teams or or just like your overall beyond just the visual, your identity, what you actually go out for feedback, you got to be okay to implement that beforehand, so that you aren't in a situation where you are actually so you don't want to put yourself in an awkward situation where you're having to say no or decline in an odd way to any feedback that they give you.
Yeah, there's definitely a balance between open to feedback and then implementing that feedback. It's the same
Yeah.
thing with even when I do my work in Salesforce, for example, as I'm working with nonprofits in Salesforce, and as the system is being rolled out to the actual people using the system, I definitely want to tell everybody, look, we want your feedback. If you think that you can improve it in some way or you want to change, let's hear it. It doesn't mean we'll necessarily implement it. We don't, not all feedback can be implemented or should be implemented, but at least having that conversation and letting them, the door is there and we are hearing them and we give a reason for why we're not doing it. That I think helps because it's, again, a communication between people at that point.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, the reasons for why. And I think, even going back with like just being truthful up front of like, before we do this feedback, here's things that we definitely won't be able to do, right? So that, because you don't want to be in a situation, like you said, where you're getting their feedback, but then you're not actually able to implement any of their suggestions.
Yeah, you definitely want to give feedback and thank them because they're giving their time, they're taking their time to give you that feedback. So you have to thank them for their time, and that is the most important part. What you do with it after is not secondary, but at least it's not as valuable to building a relationship as just saying thank you for that.
Yeah, and to be able to like the power of being able to thank them, but then say like, hey, look, we took your feedback and here's what we ended up using, and then show them. That's super powerful, and how excited they'll get.
Oh yeah.
And that's as simple as like maybe a creative concept that you use some of their ideas in, right? And said, we did this. Thanks for your feedback. You were a part of making this come to life, right?
Exactly. I mean, that must be super awesome to feel and to see that your feedback has actually made it to the final product, whatever that product is. Again, it could be a service or something, but the idea of that means, I am a co-creator to a certain extent.
Right.
So mass marketing, because that's obviously, and we're doing international mass marketing now, which is even more interesting. But I was just wondering if there's, based on current trends, considering young donors, but now they become some segment of the larger fundraising pool. Any tips, suggestions based on current events and current trends and current ways of fundraising that you could recommend for mass marketing and fundraising?
I think in my experience that this also kind of fits the current nature of fundraising is being in multiple fundraising channels is really important, and having a holistic budget for where you allocate your spending in those channels is key, so that you're able to pivot or move things around in real time, really. Sometimes daily, and when it comes to digital, or when it comes to like maybe more pre-planned channels like direct mail, you can move funds around, whether it's like your canvassing program is doing really well, but you only have a set amount of money, not being, having that flexibility to actually maybe pull from the digital budget or the direct mail budget and move some to canvassing because it's doing so well, whether it's like retention rates are high or you're getting higher monthly averages or those sorts of things. But also if there's a rapid response moment, you can really quickly spend on digital advertising, whether it's Facebook fundraising or search, and not have to be have just a set budget that you can't spend. So that's really key, and I think it's structural and also probably just chain of command and the nonprofit. And Project Hope is really great with being able to pull from like maybe spend that was pre-planned later in the year and just spending it really quickly, because during this rapid response moment, we know that it's going to bring in a lot more revenue and support than if we just let that moment go by because we didn't have any more budget. So that's like been a key for me, is the holistic budgeting and multiple channels.
So when you mentioned multiple channels and the holistic view, which I totally agree with, can you give us some examples of what you mean by channels?
Yeah, well, I'll give an example of like Project Hope, where we have a lot of different channels with different like strengths and weaknesses. So, direct mail is the tried and true channel. That's where we get a lot of donors and a predictable cost, whether it's acquisition and then obviously retention. So there's like the retention channels. And I think like when I talk about holistic budgeting, I'm really thinking of like acquisition where you're trying to grow. So we have like canvassing, which is focused on bringing people in as monthly donors, as new donors. And then we have like our digital advertising budget, whether it's paid search, display, top of funnel, social paid ads, things like that, email acquisition. All of those have just different levels of retention and value. We have a growing text messaging program. We have a telemarketing program. We have a lot of channels, and they all have their set budgets based on like order of maximum efficiency and impact on revenue. And so it's a lot of things to balance, almost like a stock portfolio. And I'm constantly moving things around based on what I'm seeing.
Any shifts? I mean, imagine that over time, fewer and fewer people are using the phone, and then maybe more and more are using social and text. Is there any trends in this kind of directions, or things that you could talk about how you've noticed it's maybe not as profitable, or the return isn't as high as it used to be if you go for this versus that?
Yeah, and I think that's also related to why it's good to be in a lot of channels is you never know when one channel suddenly, like you said, the trends actually are declining in that channel. So if you're putting all of your investment into one thing and that thing is no longer viable, you don't have anything else you can put it to really quickly. So I think there's some examples of that. But one thing to note too is exploring new channels as part of that. So having an innovation budget and looking at areas where you can explore. For example, we did that with peer-to-peer and live streaming earlier in the past few years. Crypto was an example of like where people, if they were new, text messaging is something that's new and growing for us. And conversely, with privacy changes we mentioned, Facebook advertising no longer works as well as it did just a few years back before those changes. We were really investing in that because it was working, and then it suddenly wasn't working. A lot of people started moving their budget there into other channels, especially search. So I think that's the thing that goes back to the constant change we talked about earlier and the uncertainty that makes me just like super anxious is just how quickly something that's working now, something could cause it to no longer work the next day. And then what are you going to do about it?
I really like the idea of an innovation budget too. And I imagine it's also accompanied with the idea that you're taking constant measures of all your existing channels. And if you see it seeing a trend over a certain period of time, like a downwards trend, you might need to, or you might want to pivot and reallocate some of that money to another channel because you can see those growing, for example, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's also like you could benefit if it's a channel that really takes off. You could benefit by being first to that channel before others catch up to it and saturate it. So you could take advantage of being an early adopter. There's a risk there because it could completely fail on you and it would end up being a big loss. But that's why you have to set your threshold for how much you're willing to lose to test that in its viability first, or maybe even like plant the seed there so you go right back to it if it does take off and you can still hit that early adopter window advantage.
Having the mins, max investments or innovation, it reminds me for some reason of gambling when I'm at the poker table or the blackjack table. The table is, I'm thinking more specifically of blackjack. When the table is hot, right, you want to put those chips down and really take advantage of it. And when the deck starts cooling off, you want to remove the chips or stop playing altogether. Yeah. And just having your finger on the pulse to be able to see that as it happens as best as you can, so you can adjust as needed and make those changes. I'm not sure why I mentioned gambling, but it just seemed like even when you're ahead, for example, you start losing, you have to know when to leave the table.
Sure.
These kinds of. I think there's a pretty good analogy there, but I haven't fleshed it out entirely. But the idea is the concepts are still, I think, valuable. You need to just be aware, maybe not overreact too quickly, but keep aware of these things so you can adjust as needed to be as efficient as possible or effective as possible.
Yeah, and I think it is, like you're right, it is a bit like gambling in some way. It's kind of like a combination between gambling and the stock market or an investment, right, where you do your betting. There's a lot of new things that people are always, sharing, right, to try this or that. And so there's definitely that research and vetting of like, is this where we are going to put some of our innovation budget or not? So that's like, it's hard because nobody knows, right? So there's that level of like your own experience and research on what makes the most sense and does it fit your own nonprofit's mission and audience too? Is that an audience that you can reach? That's another big part, right? Can you have creative that fit that channel, that new channel? Can you say something that's going to make sense there? So TikTok, right? TikTok is an example of they're starting a whole charity division in advertising, but it's not fully fleshed out like how Facebook was, right? But it's something new and it's a whole different audience and creative approach. So nobody's figured that out yet, but if we've tried it, right? And haven't figured it out yet. But the fact is that we've tried it. If it does take off, we've been there and we can quickly get back in.
So my next question was basically the opposite of the previous question, and so I hope you don't just say do the opposite of what I just said. But are there certain things that nonprofits should avoid doing, or be very cautious about doing that won't help them?
I think part of it, goes back to your point about the gambling piece, or even like if like in the stock market you buy at the really top. If you start seeing a trend that everybody's getting in and you haven't gotten in there yet, and then you start like, we're going to go big on this, right? And you put all of your chips in right at the top, that's a huge risk, just as much as trying something new and you're the first one, because it's oversaturated. How is your big investment as a completely new player going to do against others that have already been there and established themselves with that audience, right? That's one that comes immediately to mind.
Any other?
I think some other things are on just like a lot about what we were saying earlier of what is important that on terms of like mass market fundraising that I didn't touch on. And so I think treating your supporters as just a transaction, don't do that. Like think of them as partners across the board. This doesn't just relate to young people. This is across the board. Everybody wants to truly feel like they are being valued and appreciated. And that goes into just storytelling, really good stewardship, thank yous, like giving people problems to solve and then telling them what that achieved when they donated. Really inspiring creative, thinking of the donor experience. What happens when they come on? What's their journey going to look like? So if you don't think about that, then you're going to see high attrition rates. It's hard enough to keep people giving back to you when, again, with this nature of rapid response, anybody can kind of give to anyone in the moment. That's the new normal. So you're going to lose people to other organizations in the moment already. So those that you can really build deeper connections with, not by treating as just a transaction, is really critical in my mind.
Yeah, totally agreed there. I'm curious then, looking forward, what, based on the trends you're seeing up until this point, if you had a crystal ball, what would you guess at least are some trends that people and organizations should pay attention to? You can mention AI if you'd like to, but just the idea of, maybe or crypto or anything else that you see on the horizon that could influence or help, or something to consider in the realm of fundraising.
This question is funny because I think my answer is like, I have no idea. But I think my real true feeling is like being ready to evolve with change is key. And so if it's happening so quickly, embrace the change and be ready to evolve, whether it's a first mover, whether it's really quickly pivoting the change, micro change especially, I think is key. And I think that means like don't resist it, especially with this younger generation coming in and how new donors and audiences throughout the years might be changing philanthropy and fundraising. We have to really be ready and okay with continuing to shake things up from just traditional fundraising. So I think like going back to our discussion around community, I guess that's the closest thing I can see is like, it's going to be more and more about community building and building your community of supporters and building and creating access and trust and direct connection. People knowing directly the face of your organization, people at your organization instead of just the organization. That's where I feel like things are continuing to trend, and that's what the future is going to keep moving towards. But again, I have no idea. I could be wrong. It could be full on direct mail again. Who knows?
Well, there's a trend to go back to dumb phones, so you never know where things are going to go.
Right.
But I think that's a great call out, actually, is that saying that as long as you have a plan to adapt, that's really get ready for the change, embrace the change. And that's the key message that I can totally get underneath and support, because I agree. If things are changing so quickly, then you just can't say, "Oh, I wish things were the way that they were." It's more the opposite. It's change is going to happen. We need to adapt to it. We just can't neglect it, and let's therefore be as prepared as we can for that change, whatever that change ends up being.
Yep, exactly. And I feel like it's not what I'm in my mind. I'm not thinking like it's 100% right. Adapt to it, right? It's still like you got to balance. It's a balance, right? Like there's always going to be the traditional fundraising and the traditional best practices. And I found in my younger career days, I was a full-on direct marketer, and I was like much more like control risk, focus on test, and really like resist more innovation. I feel like it's interesting too, as I've gotten more experience and just experienced everything we've talked about. I'm much more of like that balanced approach now, where I really know what the direct marketing best practices are, and I'm also excited and eager to lean into change and figure out what makes sense for where the organization that I'm fundraising for.
Awesome. I think we've pretty much done the circle here. Unless there was something else you wanted to add, I'm happy to wrap this one up.
Awesome. Yeah, that was fun. And that truly was a circle, wasn't it?
Cool. So, Evan, I'm sure there'll be people who have questions. How can they get in touch with you? So, if you can provide your contact information or Project Hope or anything else you'd like to share.
Yeah. So, people can contact me on LinkedIn as well as via email at Project Hope, EJohnson@projecthope.org, or evanj@usa.com.
Awesome. Evan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
All right, that's it for today. I'm Alexander Lapa, and I hope you join me again in the next Agents of Nonprofit.